Hey everybody, it's Jason Blahai here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about something that really bothers me when we look at just the whole online fitness community, and specifically the diet community, and that is the fact that we have so much scientific illiteracy, pseudoscience, and people who come up with these really bizarre diet ideas that sound really good and they're convincing to a lot of people, but they're simply not based upon real science and real reality. And people who follow these ideas will tend to grab single cherry-picked studies, and they will completely ignore meta-analysis that say the opposite. And even worse, when you do produce a meta-analysis, they will come up with conspiracy theories to explain why these meta-analysis are biased completely. That they're wrong because they feel a certain person paid for them, so therefore all the data is a lie. And in reality, oftentimes they don't even realize who paid for it. And then they'll actually find that it really was an objective party who paid for it, and they'll completely ignore it. And I'd say two of the biggest ones we see here are the anti-dairy movement, people who legitimately believe that milk is bad for you. And, you know, they'll always have their anecdote. Well, I stopped drinking milk and I got less acne. It's like, well, I don't know, maybe you started washing your nasty ass face a little bit more. Maybe you improved your hygiene a little bit. You know, or you changed some other factor. I mean, just because you come up with your one anecdote literally doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things. That's not how science is done. Science is done by looking at 1 million people and looking at another 1 million people and collecting data. And just because you have an anecdotal experience doesn't really mean anything, because there could be other explanations for the one thing you experienced, all the way up to including placebo. And that's the interesting thing when we come to these things, is that people don't factor even that in of realizing, well, I read online that this would happen by the people who have this belief, and sure enough it happened. Well, there's could be placebo there, guys, and when you do studies, you have to factor in and try to control placebo. In fact, it might even include having people take something out of their diet and give them something fake and tell them it's really what it is to see if they get the placebo effect. That's oftentimes used as a variable also, and you can't discount that. But I mean, these are some of the ones that are just downright crazy. And I mean, I've seen plenty of experts and researchers who have said things like, if it wasn't actually for an online dairy movement, as a perfect example, none of us would be looking at the research on dairy. And if we just look at the data itself in a vacuum without having these social, political, or whatever agendas behind this, none of us would conclude that dairy is anything but a healthy food. You know, at least up in moderation. Obviously, most people don't want to drink a gallon of whole milk every day. Because again, the sheer amount of fat and caloric intake for most people is going to make them obese. I mean, if you're consuming 2,000 calories of a high-fat substance and you're not an athlete, and then you're consuming that on top of your other food every day, yeah, you're going to get fat. And if you gain fat while eating a high-fat diet or a diet high in saturated fat, guess what? You're going to suffer health problems. But, you know, in a vacuum, and as a reasonable part of a diet, I mean, whole milk's a perfect example. You look at this one meta-analysis here. It concluded that the only 2 types of cancer that were related to foods were that women got less ovarian cancer if they consumed more yogurt, and men who consumed large quantities of whole milks had prostate cancer at a slightly higher rate. So there does seem to be some possible causation. There's at least correlation. But the thing with that is that people will then read that and say, aha, so anyone who drinks whole milk is going to get prostate cancer. No, the vast majority of men don't get prostate cancer, including those who drink whole milk, right? Most men who drink 3 or 4 glasses of whole milk every day still never develop prostate cancer. But that does seem to be linked with consuming very large amounts of it, does seem to be linked with up to a 50% higher prostate cancer rate. But 50% over something that's a disease that only a small number of men get isn't an enormous increase, possible cause for concern. You know, same thing with the yogurt and ovarian cancer in women. It does seem to have a modest reduction on it, but there could be a lot of other factors there. People have even concluded that it could have something to do with the cultures, the live and active cultures in the yogurt. It has nothing to do with the dairy component. So, there's a lot of factors there. But when you look at it as a whole, the overwhelming majority of the meta-analysis don't show any real concern for dairy. And when I linked this one the other day, this one that's up in the background right now, there are people who said, well, that meta-analysis is paid for by the dairy industry. Actually, it was paid for by the Chinese government. What? This study actually had multiple countries involved, including Japan. Japan contributed to the study, but this one was done by the national university in Beijing, China. So it was paid for by the Chinese government. Now, this is the same Chinese government that, all the China study dealt with, where the Dr. Campbell concluded, and people said the data doesn't actually say that, that's just his own quack conclusion of it, did the China study. So put that in perspective. This is a government basically seeking to know the truth. They want to know the truth. They're paying for the science behind it, the research, to say, hey, let's figure out what's going on here. And like I said, outside of those two things, it found no link with cancer and dairy. But that's not the dairy industry. Last time I checked, the Chinese government is not the dairy industry. But, people have these crazy conspiracy theories with it. And, just like the people with the ketogenic diet stuff, when you get studies that show ketogenic diets aren't all that great, what do the followers of those diets jump up and scream? Well, Big Sugar paid for it. Big Sugar paid for it. And then when you get other stuff, the other directions, the vegans all scream that the meat industry paid for this. And that's funny because those are two opposite extremes of diets, and yet each group has these conspiracy theories that when the meta-analysis doesn't agree with their diet, guess what? Well, it was clearly the anti-meat people, the sugar industry, that paid for it, and then when it's the other way around, clearly the meat industry paid for this. Why don't you guys just look at the data itself? That's what we need to look at. Look at the data itself and see what's really going on. But it's always a conspiracy theory. So we fall back to anti-science every time the meta-analysis disagrees with whatever your niche, quack, whack-ass nutrition ideas are. Because ketogenic diets, what do we know based upon the research? People on ketogenic diets versus more balanced diets, yeah, they can lose weight, because ketogenic diets are appetite suppressing, and you get tired of eating the same food. I mean, if you eat steak, eggs, water, and spinach every day, and that's the only 4 things you consume every day, after about a month, your calories are going to go down. And after a couple months, they're going to go down further, because you just get sick of eating the exact same 3 or 4 foods over and over and over and over every day. It gets boring. You eat less, right? You eat less. Having a less varied diet is one of the most effective, at least short-term methods of fat loss ever seen. But then people mess that diet up too, and they try to come up with ways to make ketogenic brownies and stuff, and then they wonder why they're still 100-pound extra body weight pile of lard after being on their ketogenic diet for a year. I don't know, because you should have stuck to steak, eggs, and water. And then you would have lost that 100 pounds. But the thing is, we know that ketogenic diets, particularly for active people, you lose more muscle on the same calories on a ketogenic diet, and versus a higher carb diet, you usually lose slightly less fat. They're not that effective. They also, at any point you stop losing weight and your weight stagnates on a ketogenic diet, people's blood work look good on them while they're losing weight. But then again, people's blood work look good when they're doing the Twinkie diet also. Remember the professor who lost 30 pounds on the Twinkie diet? His blood work looked great. He lived on Twinkies, protein shakes, and a multivitamin, lost 30 pounds, and while he was still losing weight, his blood work looked phenomenal. As soon as you go back to maintenance and you stop losing weight, guess what happens on a ketogenic diet? Your LDL cholesterol goes up. Well, they'll argue wrongly that, well, LDL, there's 2 types of LDL, and see, LDL isn't really that bad. And then they'll argue that, oh, dietary cholesterol doesn't affect LDL. No, it doesn't in everyone. But saturated fat intake does. And saturated fat's not cholesterol. Well, what's the data we have now? There's been, by this International Atherosclerosis Board determined at this point, we now have enough data to actually not just have correlation, but causation between elevated LDL and hardening of the arteries. So if you stay on like a ketogenic diet long term and you stop losing weight at any point on it and your weight maintains on it, your LDL goes up and you're now predisposing yourself to heart disease. Now they'll argue your triglycerides go down, but you know what? Because you're eating less refined sugar. Everyone who eats less refined sugars, triglycerides go down. That's a good thing. Eating large amounts of refined sugar isn't good for you, right? It's not good for you. But your ketogenic diet didn't cause that. It's just the fact that you quit putting table sugar in everything and quit drinking soda. And that's the reality of it. None of these people want to admit that their ideas aren't really backed by the science. They aren't backed by the hard data. The meta-analysis kind of say, look, what you're doing is not all that great, or you're just flat wrong. And it's not saying people can't lose weight on a ketogenic diet. Of course they can. Plenty of people can. But for athletic people, it's probably not the best method. The research shows it's not the best method. It can work, but there are healthier and more effective ways to get the job done. And then when you stop losing, it has health risk. And furthermore, you lose more muscle on it. But I know this ripped guy who does it. Yeah, how many steroids does he use to maintain that muscle mass? You've got to factor these things in. They're not based on the real science. It's cherry-picked data. The same thing with the anti-dairy stuff. The majority of studies show that dairy is perfectly healthy, and again, most nutrition researchers say if it wasn't for this anti-milk paleo agenda or the vegan agenda screaming about dairy and milk, we would be looking at the data and not think there's anything wrong, meaning there's nothing in the data when we look at the total amount of it that it would even suggest it's an unhealthy food. But we have to keep doing further studies because these fringe groups are screaming over it and they push it into the mainstream. Now you have actors and actresses screaming about how bad milk is. Hell, it even made it into the movie Snatch, if you guys remember that. I remember that. It's not based on reality, though. The research shows that milk and most dairy in moderation is not only benign, but has actual health benefits. Dairy is generally a healthy food for the majority of people on the earth. Now, some people will argue, well, you know, lactose intolerance is really high in certain ethnic groups. Yeah, well, that's fine. How does that affect the rest of us? You know, just because there is an ethnic group that has a high rate of lactose intolerance, does that mean everyone else should change their diet? That's insane. That's literally insane. That would also be like saying because people of a certain skin color don't seem to need vitamin D3 in a certain environment, that no one needs to take it in that environment. You'll be just fine. That's not reality. You need to base things upon your individual needs. And if you happen to fall under a subgroup that has a certain health issue or a certain intolerance to food, then obviously it's different for you than for everyone else. But that doesn't mean everyone else needs to base their lifestyle upon your intolerance. You know, it's like just because your neighbor has a food allergy doesn't mean that you should quit eating that food if you enjoy it and it's healthy. That's not even rational. That's actually kind of insane. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.